hearings way back then. And one day I got a letter in the mail from the senator, and I keep it on my office wall at home. Margaret Chase Smith, the blue rose. It's dated April 10th, 1992. Dear Amy Calder, and that's how she wrote to people. I think David might know this, wherever David went. She would often say, Dear John Smith, or dear, she didn't just say Dear Amy. So, Dear Amy Calder, your contribution to the Waterville Morning Sentinel was just called to my attention. I have read it and hasten to thank you for writing as you did. You are so right in your references to me and others, and I commend you for your thoughtfulness. I commend you for sharing your thoughts with others sincerely. And her name is kind of faded a little, but I suspect Angie typed this. But that is just something I totally, it's so precious to me, and I keep it on my wall, and it just reminds me of just her independence and how important independence is, especially in these times. So on to the book. I thought what I would do is just talk a little bit about how the book came to be, and maybe read a couple of columns and then open it up to questions, or as I like to say, a conversation, because I really love to hear from you too. I like to know what you think. So, hi Davida, how are you? You made it. As many of you know, I've been a reporter at the Morning Sentinel for 35 years, and I cover, my regular beat is Waterville city government, but I also cover other things happening in various places, because at a small newspaper, you end up doing a little bit of everything. I do the police, I do crime, economic development, I cover the city council and planning board. You know, if something happens up this way and there's no reporter on, or the person whose beat it is can't make it, I come. So I've covered just about every beat that the newspaper has had or has. And many years ago, I wrote a local feature column as well as news. I think I did it for about 7 years, and it fizzled out. But about 15 years ago, the city editor, George Myers Jr., the then city editor, asked if I would start writing a feature column again, which is very different than news writing. And the commitment is once a week, you have to have it written. And you can write about anything you want. You can write about your past, you can write about characters that you meet, you can write about interesting things that are happening and so forth. So I said, okay, I'll try it. And if it works out, great. And if, after a time, I feel as if it's getting silly or useless or, whatever, I'll stop it. So I called it Reporting Aside, and I deliberately decided not to write about anything political or to write about anything that I'm covering in the news, because it isn't right for a journalist to, say, for instance, cover a city council meeting and then write a feature column that gives your opinion about something that's going on. That's just not, it's not proper. It's not appropriate to do, because you're supposed to be neutral and you're supposed to get both sides and be fair and be accurate and all that. So I thought I will try to focus on interesting people, things that are educational or informative, or just interesting things that are going on. And so it's been 15 years, and along the way, people asked, they'd say, why don't you put your columns in a book? And I thought, oh yeah, that would be nice, but I'm so busy every day just doing the news and getting the column in, and it has to be done once a week. You can't just say, I'm not going to write one this week. If you're scraping the bottom of the barrel and you don't have an idea, well, I have a couple of methods. One is to look online at, like, for instance, this Saturday is June 24. And so I might go online and Google what happened in history on June 24th. And is it anything that might relate to something that happened in Central Maine? And if so, I might write about that. Or I might think about something from my childhood and write that. Or if I'm really, really scraping the bottom of the barrel, I'll get in my car and drive around. you know, come to Skowhegan or Fairfield or whatever. And inevitably I find someone doing something, and people are just they're so generous with their time, and they are so good about telling their story. And once you sit and talk with people long enough, I always say, you always find something really fascinating. Everybody has a story. Everybody in this room has a story. And if I were to sit down and interview you, it might be the last question I ask you that is something so fascinating that I say, that's what this column is about. And then, you know, so anyway, I really enjoy writing a column. It's a lot of work doing full-time news and a column, but I just feel so honored to be able to tell people's stories, particularly people that have these really unbelievable, compelling stories. So a couple of years ago, it took 2 years to publish the book. A couple of years ago, I got together with Islandport Press, which is the company that published my book. It's in North Yarmouth, and Dean Lunt, the editor-in-chief, our company, Maine Today Media, which owns most of the newspapers in Maine, with the exception of the Daily News, we have a good relationship with Islandport, and some of our writers and editors have published books through Islandport. And my CEO, Lisa DeSisto, was really supportive of the idea of doing a book, and we got together, and Dean Lunt said, why don't you send me, I think that's Paul up there. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Amy.
I talked to you on the phone and email, but yes.
That's right.
I was just talking about your sister and father before you came in. Paul Mills, by the way. So where was I? So he said, why don't you send me 70 columns and we'll go from there and try to, you know, choose columns that are, you know, pertinent to Central Maine that people might be interested in. So my husband Phil and I, Phil up in the back with a green shirt, my number one critic, best critic, which I say in the book. And I went through, we spent a whole weekend going through all these columns, and I had about 800 at the time. And being old fashioned, I keep them, I clip every column I write, and I put them in these notebooks in these plastic sleeves, and they're all dated. And, you know, I have several of these books with the dates. And the young people I work with, they think I'm nuts. They say, why do you do that? You can just go online and get all this stuff. And I said, yeah, but you know what? If the internet goes to HELL, I'll have all my stuff and you won't have anything. They're really great. These young people I work with, they teach me stuff about technology and all this new stuff. And I have institutional memory, so I help them with stuff. And they're really great to work with. Anyway, so the book, my husband and I went through the books. We chose 70. It was an arduous process, but we ended up selecting about 70, and then I later on sent some more to Dean, and he had me do all kinds of things like write transitional, because there are 3 sections to the book. The first part is called Growing Up in the 1960s. I grew up in Skowhegan. And the second part is called On the Beat, interesting things that I've come in contact with along the way. And the third part is the people I meet, which are the newer columns. Most of them are newer. And just some special ones that I chose because the people were so interesting. And then they did a little bit of editing, but of course the columns were already edited. So then it was published in January, and I've been doing this book tour. This is number 19. But this is really special. This is really special because I grew up here and knew David when, I don't know what your title was when I was on the assistant director with Regular Land. Right. We had a lot of good times at the advisory committee, on which Paul's father, Peter Mills Sr., was a member. And also, I think Janet may have been, yeah.
Janet was on the foundation board too.
She was on the foundation board too. So I thought the name of the book came from one of the columns that I wrote, which I would like to read if it's okay with everybody. It's kind of special to me because it's about my growing up and spending time in barns. It's called Comfort is an Old Barn. I hate seeing old barns sagging and leaning from the weight of time and aging timbers. Can everybody hear? Okay. Many years ago, as I traveled around central Maine chasing stories, I'd make mental notes of all those old barns I saw with the intention of one day photographing them and collecting the images in a book. The barns were so beautiful, their gray shingles weathered from sun, rain, and snow. I knew that one day they'd fall away and disappear, and we'd never see them again. I regret that I never photographed them as planned. The old barns of Maine carry lots of stories, hold many memories, and remind us of the sweetness of rural life. There's something exquisite about an old barn standing there in a field, a remnant from a time when farmers tossed hay into wagons with pitchforks on a hot summer day, the scent of fresh hay wafting through the air. Barns were an integral part of my youth. I can't dream about my past without remembering those magnificent structures where horses stomped around in their stalls, eyeing us curiously as we approached, and cows chewed on feed. The scent of hay was intoxicating. My friends and I would climb up into the hay lofts and meander through the bales, hold conferences, and take turns jumping off into hay mows below. Barns were great napping places, quiet, comfortable, and safe. It was never a wasted day spending time in a barn with the animals, feeding, washing, and brushing a horse, shoveling manure and spreading a fresh bed of straw, or merely sitting on a bucket watching someone else do it. Sweeping away errant chaff from old barn boards, polishing a saddle, organizing bits and bridles on posts. It was all good work, satisfying work. I got to thinking about those barns one day while attempting to tidy up and organize my mother's barn, the barn I spent many days in as a youth. I know every nook and cranny of that old structure, every beam, peg, and hole in the floorboards. The barn still visits my dreams, albeit it has been decades since I played there. As children, we staged plays and dance recitals in the second floor loft, assigning seats below to the mothers of the neighborhood kids who performed there. We played house, hospital, hide and seek, and storekeeper in the barn, climbing deftly up and down beams like monkeys, never needing a ladder. We had hiding places, cubby holes, and special rooms designated for club meetings. The barn kept our secrets. My friend Terry got the nickname Hayseed from spending so much time there. It was our castle, the place we ran to when a summer shower struck. It was a day-long refuge during a good hard rain. There's nothing so sweet as sitting just inside the open front door of a barn during a downpour, watching the world outside from that safe, dry, contemplative place. There's comfort to be found from being inside a barn, a sense of being grounded. Although we sold the family property in Skowhegan after my mother died on New Year's Day in 2015, I still dream about the old barn where I spent so many happy hours. In those modern dreams, I climb to the second floor loft where an ancient dusty canoe lies across the floorboards. Chipped cups and saucers we used to play house are scattered about. Boxes of discarded books and other debris are stacked in corners, and barn swallows are swooping in and out of a broken window at the roof's peak. Balancing as if on a tightrope, I step across a wooden plank perched over an open chicken coop below. Although the plank bows in the middle, I never fall in. Those dreams, I think, portend that all is well, despite what we have lost to time. In those old barns, we learned, discovered, imagined, dreamed fearlessly, and prevailed. Yeah, it brings back memories. Sometimes I will write a column where I see something that kind of fascinates me, and then I kind of research it and write a column, which is what happened one winter. It was very cold. We live in Waterville, and I went outside one cold winter day on the back lawn where the snow was sort of, mounded up. It was sparkling. I saw this dead crow, and I had never seen a dead crow out there. And I thought, what would make this crow be dead in the backyard? What happened to this crow? So I thought, well, I'll kind of Google around on the internet, see what I can find. And I found all sorts of things that, some people got philosophical. They'd say, oh, if you see a dead crow, that's a harbinger of bad luck. That's something bad's going to happen. And some people said, oh, no, that's good. That means you have good things coming your way. Anyway, and I called Doug Hitchcock. He's a he's with the Maine Audubon, and he knows so much about birds, and he said, crows, they eat carrion along the roads, and it could be that they got hit by a car, and didn't die until it landed on your backyard. It could have hit a window or a wall, or it could have been diseased. Or he said that crows have they have bones that are hollow, they're like straws, and they're very brittle, so if they hit on impact they can die pretty quickly. So I wrote this column, and I got an email from a woman named Nancy Foster who lives in Waterville, and she said, Amy, she said, you have got to talk with my cousin Lee Bureau. He had a pet crow when he was a kid living in Waterville, and he's got stories you won't believe. So she gave me his number, and I called him up. And when I interviewed him, I said, oh my, here's another column. Because this one really, and this is one of my favorites. This is one of my husband's favorite columns. It's called Waterville's Top Bird. Crows really are fascinating creatures. After I wrote a column about a dead crow I found in my backyard, I received lots of interesting comments from people relating their own experiences with crows. However, none were more compelling than the story I heard from Nancy Foster of Waterville. She said that in the early 50s, her cousins Joy and Lee Bureau had a pet crow named Smokey, and he was smart and mischievous and so well known about town that when he died, his obituary appeared on the front page of the Morning Sentinel. That piqued my interest. Smokey wreaked havoc with the police as he was always stealing parking tickets off car windows in downtown, Foster wrote. I remember that he would fly into Woolworths and pick up a sparkly bracelet and fly away. Stores back then didn't have air conditioning. Doors were commonly left open. I had to know more about Smokey, so I called Lee Bureau, and we had a good long chat about the crow, who was a celebrity in Waterville. Bureau's sister Joy befriended the crow, who had fallen out of a nest. At first, she kept it in a cage where she fed it and talked to it every day and taught it to say hello, Bureau said. Smokey then learned other words, much to the amazement of everyone, and he recognized faces, particularly those of Bureau family members. The family lived on North Street. Lee Bureau, who was 15 at the time, slept outside in a tent all summer, he said. He had a newspaper route, and he had to get up at 4:30, and Smokey would act as his alarm clock, flying into the tent every morning and pecking and pulling at his blanket. If that didn't work, the crow became more aggressive, said Bureau, now 80. He'd jump right up on my head and take his beak and stick it in my ear like there was something in there, Bureau recalled. It was just a riot, 4:30, and he gets me up. I'd get on my motor scooter, and he'd ride on my shoulder. I'd go over the North Street Bridge, and there was something about it he liked. He'd spread his wings and disappear, and I kept going. I'd see him way off in the distance. He'd play games. When I'd slow down, he'd come back, and he'd be on my shoulder, and we'd be eye to eye, and he'd make funny noises. That bird was amazing. He knew my paper route better than I did. While Smokey lived on the Bureau property, he also flew around town, and especially liked Rummel's ice cream stand on Silver Street. People would feed him, Bureau said. They didn't know what to make of him. He had quite a vocabulary. People just couldn't believe it. He flew all over the city. People would call up and say, hey, Lee, your bird's over here. He took clothespins off my line. Sometimes Smokey would remove clothesline catches, which caused people's sheets to drag on the ground, according to Bureau. He liked little things, eyeglasses, nickels, combs, shiny things. He had a secret place down by the high school, a 3-story apartment house in the eaves of the building. Everybody kept saying he's got his stuff up there, but nobody dared to go up. Bureau's father, Harvey, finally got a 40-foot ladder that reached up to the spot, and they found the stash, he said. There were safety pins and earrings and all these little things that he had up there. Smokey loved raw hamburger, and when he got hungry, he'd fly home to get some. Bureau said the crow could see a hamburger from a long distance. One day, the crow plucked $200 in cash from Bureau's father's t-shirt pocket as he was talking to the local football coach in the driveway, and flew up to the chimney on the roof next door. Fearing Smokey would release the money from his beak and drop it in the chimney, they took action. My father said, quickly, go get some hamburger. So I ran in the house and got some hamburger. Smokey saw that hamburger and dropped the money, and the money was rolling down the roof. Can't make this stuff up. One of the most amazing things about Smokey is that he knew what classroom Lee and his sister attended all day at the old high school, now Gilman Apartments on Gilman Street. He'd land on the windowsill and peck on the glass, Bureau recalled. He knew where my sister was. My French teacher was scared to death. I said, "Don't be afraid, it's just my pet crow." I went to the window and he'd walk back and forth on the windowsill outside and then fly off. Bureau credits his sister Joy, who died many years ago, for spending so much time with Smokey that he became part of the family and could learn to talk. Smokey, who was Bureau's best buddy for about 3 years, ultimately met a sad end in 1952. It was winter, and the crow lived in the garage when it was cold, but as temperatures dipped to 15 below zero, the family got worried and put him in their cellar, where he would fly around, talk, and play games, according to Bureau. But one day, he pecked open a bag of ready cement and ingested some and died. The family was devastated, Bureau recalled. I was really bent. I didn't realize I could be so attached to a crow. It was sad. It really was. Smokey was featured in the Morning Sentinel several times. A photo with his front page obituary shows then police officer Joe Pliska directing traffic on Main Street downtown as Smokey struts across the street. There's people that remember him to this day, Bureau said. They see me and they say, "Aren't you the guy that had that crow?" So many people have their own stories about him. He was absolutely amazing. Crows are so smart. You wouldn't believe the things that Smokey would do. Carry a twig a long ways and hop up on the table and give it to me when I was doing a project. It was quite remarkable. I had so much fun with that crow. Recently, Bureau went to Wendy's restaurant on Main Street, and there was a group of crows walking around. He saved some of his hamburger for them, and he looked one right in the eye and talked to it, he recalled. "I could see my crow," he said. "They're such beautiful birds." Poor Lee died a couple of years ago, and but I just sort of had to write this story for historic reasons, I guess. You know, people in Waterville still remember him and the crow. And I did talk to Doug Hitchcox from Maine Audubon afterwards, and he said, you know, crows, it's their natural habitat to be out in the cold, so he would have survived, but there was no way that they could have known that. You know, they were just trying to protect him. But yeah, so these are some of the things I come in contact with. There are other times that I will think of something. It's a little Skowhegan column, which I'd like to read. There are a lot of things about Skowhegan in here, particularly in the beginning, but there's one called Maine's Odd Quirky Road Names, which and I'll tell you how that came to be too. Let's see. I've just lost my place. Oh, here we are. Didn't my new coworker laugh when she was writing the cop log one day and came across a street in Freedom, Maine called Goosepecker Ridge? Molly Shelley, who landed here from Pennsylvania 3 months ago, has since been learning all sorts of things about Central Maine and the state in general. She loves it here. More recently, she discovered Grumpy Men Avenue in Anson. You can't make this stuff up, and doubled over in laughter. Quote, in Anson Friday at 10:32 a.m., a theft was reported on Grumpy Men Avenue, the log says. It's true, we Mainers have a propensity for dreaming up crazy, quirky, and peculiar street and road names. I told Molly she hadn't yet come across Sesame, Big Bird, Boo, and Blah streets in Skowhegan, or Chicken Street in the town of Starks. And of course, there's Katie Crotch Road in Emden, where the road sign has been stolen many, many times, according to 89-year-old Eleanor Ketchum, the town's E911 addressing officer. Ketchum told me a family with the last name Cadie, C-A-D-I-E, lived on a corner of the road a very long time ago, and over the years, the name got twisted. That's people for you, Ketchum said. Just like other things, one person mispronounces something just a little, and the next thing you know, somebody picked it up and away it goes. Somerset County has some of the most unusual names. Hole in the Wall Road in Athens, No Way, also in Athens, Shire Road in Palmyra, Rowdy Lane and Weed Lane in Burnham. Do they smoke something there? And Nodder Road in Canaan. Newport in Penobscot County has a downwind boulevard. I wonder what it's downwind of. One street name that particularly caught my eye, Back to Sanity Drive in Moscow, which is way up north near Jackman. Madison has a crazy lane. Madison, which has a crazy lane, must be in competition. In Kennebec County, there's Bumpy Road, Piggery Road, Stephen King Drive. There's a plug for the Bangor horror writer, and White Rice Lane, all in Augusta. The town of Greene has Welcome Hill Road, in contrast to Go Away, That Way, and This Way in Liberty. There's a dirt road in Albion and an Opportunity Way in Waterville, and in Oakland, a Go Down Trail and Electric Avenue. And similarly, Emden has a Kilowatt Drive. Gardner is home to Dazzle Lane and Just Away. Sydney boasts Mellow Hill, and the town of Fayette has Our Road. Thorndike in Waldo County has an eerie name, Coffin Road. I don't think I'd want to live there. There are some places out of void, including Harm's Way in Belgrade, Dismal Drive in Monmouth, and Dire Straits in Palermo. I hope there are detours around Hostel Valley Road in Palermo and Vipa Lane in Farmington. I wonder what neighbors do on that latter street anyway. Palermo also has a Boots and Saddle Road. Now there's a mouthful. And Fairfield's got a Scat Street. Scat of what? There are some odd ones in Franklin County, including Hernia Hill Road and Carabasset Valley. Is that because ascending it results in injury? Rough Drive and Strong, Tilt of the Kilt Road in Rangeley, and Crash Road in Jag. Though central Maine communities certainly seem to employ the creative spark when it comes to naming streets, I've decided Skowhegan takes the grand prize for frequency. In addition to having Sesame, Big Bird, Boo, and Blah streets, Skowhegan also is home to MRI Drive, White Chicken Road, and Lois Lane. And to think I grew up here, truly a town after my own heart. I had a lot of fun with that one. In my travels around, doing stories, I would come across these road names and I'd just be like, oh, I have to write these down. So I decided one day I would write a column, and that was what resulted. But I think along the way, what I did was I went on the websites of all the towns that we cover. I tried to at least get all the towns that we cover, and I went to the assessor's database and looked at all the road names, and I would come across these really funny ones, so I put them in the column. But yeah, that was a fun one. One other story I want to tell you before I open it up to questions, and then I want to talk about the senator a little bit, because she was something. The cover of the book is a photo. It's 30 years old. It was taken in 1992. It's a picture of me ostensibly feeding a cow out of my hand. The photo was taken by a fellow named Algis Chenesis. I don't know if any of you know him. Jenny might remember him from school. I graduated from Skowhegan in 74, and I think he was in the class of 75. He was kind of a quiet guy. He had long blonde hair. His father was an anesthesiologist here at the hospital, and they lived in Norridgewock, and Algis was in theater. We would do plays together and stuff. He was very artistic. I liked him. I didn't realize until years later that he, in high school, went to these cemeteries in Norridgewock and took all these photos of all the stones. Really beautiful photographs that I saw years later. But he told me this story once, that many years later, that in high school he had this Latin teacher who didn't like him for some reason. And in class one day, in front of the whole class, he said to Algis, you're never going to amount to anything. And of course, Algis took it, he took it hard. It was hard, especially having been said in front of the whole class. But as it turns out, Algis became a world-renowned photographer. And he traveled around the world taking photos and he's photographed lots of famous people, Jackie Kennedy and presidents and so forth. And in 30 years ago, I was working at the Skowhegan Bureau here at the Sentinel, and he called me up. He was living in Canada, in Toronto at the time. He still lives in Canada. And he said, I'm going to be in Maine, and do you want to do a story? I have this traveling exhibit. It's in New York City right now. It's called Holy Cow. He had gone to India and photographed 5,000 cows and did this exhibit. I said, oh, I'd love to do it. So he came to the Bureau, and I interviewed him, and we talked about old times, and it was great. And I said, let me get a photo of you, Al, just to go with the story. And he said, okay, why don't we go find a farm somewhere where there are cows, and that would illustrate it really well. So we did. We drove through downtown, and we went up Malden's Mills Road and started heading toward the West Ridge Road, and on the left is the Earl Farm. Some of you might know the Earl Farm. The kids, the younger family lived way up on the hill, but the grandparents lived closer to the road, and that's where he said, "Oh, stop right here." So we did, and he said, "I'll stand over here where the cows were on the hill and take." So I took some photos, and I had this black and white Pentax K1000 that I took pictures with. It's around my neck here, and then I said, "Okay, let's go have lunch or something." And he said, "Well, let me take a couple pictures of you." I said, "Oh, okay." So he positioned me and he said, walk to the right a little bit, walk to the left a little bit, pick up your hand. No, put your palm up. And so I did, and I'm grinning away, and he took some pictures, and we left, and we had lunch and said goodbye, and it was a great time. Good to see him. And then a couple of weeks later, I get this envelope from Canada. In it is an 8x10 black and white photo of me feeding a cow out of my hand. So when they were looking for a cover for the book, I went through all these old photos and I found it, and I thought, "Oh, that's great." So I sent it in, and they liked it, so they used it. And I'm friends with Al just on Facebook, so I Facebook messaged him and said, "Do you mind?" And he said, "Oh, I'd be honored." So I was the recipient of that wonderful gift that I never knew would be on a book one day. Did we have any questions or comments? Or no question is stupid. That's my motto, because I ask questions all day long, and I learn lots of things, even from the seemingly tiny things and questions that I ask. So thank you.
I spend the summer at Lake Wissarunsett,
Yes.
and I know you worked at Lakewood, and that's
Yes.
a big part of our summer. We always get season tickets and see all the shows, and I wonder if you could talk a little about that, your experience there.
Oh, it's funny you're asking this, because the last book event I had was in East Madison last week, and we talked a lot about Lakewood. There was a woman there that worked there when I worked there. I worked there for 3 summers in the 70s when I was in college, and the first 2 summers I was a box office assistant, and the 3rd summer I was a box office manager. And there is a column in the book about Lakewood and my experiences there. It's a huge part of my existence, I guess you could say. I have lots of posters from Lakewood and programs, and I met fascinating actors and actresses who were so giving of their time. And it was just the column, I think I called it My Camelot, because it was kind of like that. It was this beautiful setting on the water, and we worked really hard. You hardly had time off, but in the evenings we would go into the inn and talk with the actors and the directors and all those people, and we played bocce on the lawn in the sun, and it was a great place. I remember one night on Friday nights we would have a lobster feed for the cast and crew, because at the time there were casts and crew that came from, or casts that came for a week, like they do Jesus Christ Superstar, and it was the same cast, and they did a matinee and then an evening show. And on Friday nights we would have a lobster feed for them, where we would go into one of the cottages and cook lobsters and corn on the cob. And there was a woman named Mary Jane Renfret who was a teacher, and she was like the house manager, and she would orchestrate these lobster feeds, and she had a great relationship with everybody. So the time that Milton Berle was there, he came to the lobster feed in the Byron Cottage where I lived, and he regaled us till 4 in the morning with stories about vaudeville and all these stories about being on the stage and screen. And he was such a nice guy, and just was great with his time, and answered our questions, and it was wonderful. I remember that. And then there was another time and I think I mentioned it in the column, I met these 2 older actresses called Louise Kirkland and Anita Webb, and they were in Arsenic and Old Lace. They were quite a pair. I really got to know them well. And one night we were in the inn, and my teeth were chattering. It was so cold. And I was just this young, skinny person. And she said, "What you need is a Brandy Alexander." I said, "What?" It sounded so regal to me. So she ordered me a Brandy Alexander. Oh, wow. That went down pretty well. Anyway, we became friends. And so she invited me to New York City. She and Anita Webb, they said, oh, you must come down to New York. Well, I did, because I was going to school in Connecticut. I took a train down. They took me, oh, they were so funny. We went to see, I think we went to see the Broadway show, 42nd Street. And I've got a picture of that at home. And then we went to Sardi's restaurant, where all the, famous people go and their pictures all over the walls. Charles Nelson Riley came to our table. Oh, of course, you imagine my eyes were so big. He was in his cups that night, but he kissed my hand, and oh, I was just in heaven. But that was so sweet, just from working at Lakewood. Those are some of the things that sort of happened after things that happened afterwards. So that's in that column. There are some other things which I don't remember exactly, but that's a long answer to your question.
That's great.
Yeah, that was fun. In fact, Margot lives on West Sunset Lake, right? Yes. Is Margot right? Yeah. Now, did some of your relatives work at Lakewood, or?
I worked in the bar.
Okay.
On matinee days.
Okay.
With Madeline, remember Madeline? Boy, she was a bartender.
Not sure.
She
What
was a
years?
bartender.
What years were you there?
Oh, boy. All I know is that the night of the solar eclipse, I was working and I had to go see it. So I left and go past the golf course to Hill so I could see it. But, yeah, it was a wonderful place to work.
Yeah.
Interesting, fun people and
Right.
yeah.
And at the time, all the buildings around it were all owned by the
Yes.
theater,
Yes.
and then they later got sold off. But
Everything was well kept.
yeah, it sure was. Yeah,
Fun.
those were the days.
When the whole cast came up from New York, that's when, before they.
Right.
Local things.
Yeah, right. That's right. And before the cast came up for a week, then they would have actors would come for specific shows.
Yeah,
Not a whole cast, but just, like Bogart was there.
yes.
We met Sylvia Sidney and Lana Turner. Oh, Lana Turner. She was beautiful. She was so nice. She was probably in her 70s. She was just gorgeous. And she had this young boyfriend. And he was, I don't know, he might have been 30 or something. But anyway, they stayed in the Byron Cottage. And the Byron Cottage is where Howard Hughes used to stay when he came to Lakewood back in the day. He would fly his float plane in and park it there and stay in that cottage. You can imagine the dreams I would have in that house, knowing that he had been there. Anyway, Lana Turner was in the Byron Cottage, and the maids who cleaned the cottages and changed the beds and stuff said, oh, remember they said she's got boxes of Kleenex in every room, sometimes 2 or 3 in each room. We couldn't figure out what she did. It must have been the makeup or something, but there was always gossip on the side about things. She was so sweet that, and Lynn Redgrave was another one that was very nice. Imogene Coca. She was great, but she was very blind. And I remember we were sitting in the box office one day looking out and saw her walk into a birch tree. So, the little stand of birches that was in front of them. Yeah, she was okay, but yeah. Farley Granger, I had dinner with him one night in the end. Here I was this young person. I didn't even know who he was, but we had this great time. And then later I saw all the films that he was in. It was a great thing for a young person to do. Work there. Yes, Paul?
Well, I was kind of fascinated by the association your grandfather had with Robert Frost.
Oh,
I
yes.
just, if you could elaborate on
Sure.
that anyway, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. There's a column in here about the fact that, is that Rachel with that? No, sorry. You look like my niece. Sorry. My grandparents on my mother's side, Harold and Nettie Rowell, he was a school principal and she was a teacher, and they had a summer house in Cornville. But during the year, they would travel around to different places and teach. And, you know, they went to like Rumford and Jackman. My mother graduated from Jackman, and they were in Franconia, New Hampshire at Dow Academy. And at the time, Robert Frost lived in Franconia. And he would go to the school. My grandfather knew him and they were friends. And, you know, he would come to the school and talk to the kids. And my aunt at the time, Barbara Kirkpatrick, tied a little string around Robert Frost's finger and said, "This is for you to remember me by." But my friends, John and Carol Uni, who are here, came with my husband and I to the Frost house one summer. We went on a little foray. We went to Dow Academy and we saw the school and took pictures. It's now, well, it was then, it was a sort of an apartment house. And the man there, you know, he knew of the school and all that. But we went to the Frost house and we toured the Frost house, and there was a barn next door, and at the time they were having a poetry gathering of poets, and they were doing their thing. We walked through, in the back field, there's like a pathway going through where the trees are, and there are little, I think parts of his poems sort of posted at different places around. And when we went back to the house, there was a young woman who was working there, and I told her of my connection with Robert Frost, and she said, "Well, you know, we have a poet in residence here, but so we don't usually take people into this private part of the house, but we'll take you through." There were just the four of us, so it was really special. We went into the Robert Frost living room, and everything was the way it was when he lived there. They tried to keep it that way, and we went up and saw his bedroom and looked out the window that overlooks the mountains, and I think it was in the sitting room or the living room, there was a glass case, and in it was a letter to Mr. Rowell, and that was my grandfather's name. So I thought, oh my gosh, but it wasn't my uncle. It was a letter to his grandfather's lawyer named Rowell, I think, who was handling the transaction of the sale of the house or something like that. But that was a memorable experience. I would urge anyone to go and see that house. It's really beautiful. And there's another Frost house in, I think, Bennington, Vermont, that I'd like to see. Does that answer the question, Paul?
Yes,
Okay.
okay, wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. When we were growing up, my father and my whole family, really, we were taught to read Robert Frost's poems and memorize them. Like, I can remember sitting in my grandmother's house reciting Robert Frost late into the night, and we had this 33 record of him reading his own poems, and I can still hear that scratchy old record. But I think if you live in Maine or New Hampshire, you can really relate to all the stuff that he writes. It's just beautiful. How are we doing for time, David?
Well, before I answer that question, what's the reaction of your siblings to the book?
Oh, let's see. That's a good question. Oh, they just kind of laugh. They giggle. They think it's great. I think I didn't say any bad things about them. Like, if they misbehaved, I don't think I told a lot of misbehaviors. But we were seven of us, and I was the youngest, and so I got to watch all these crazy things they did when we were kids. And so I just would sit and listen and watch. And my oldest brother was 9 years older, but I mean, we fished and we climbed trees and traipsed through the woods and built cabins and just had a great childhood. I think the most mischievous thing we did, my older brothers would work on these old cars out in the yard. And I could see my older brother, Richard, now and his friends pulling an engine out of a car on a pulley over the tree branch, you know, pulling and fixing it and putting it back. But they would race these cars around the field. We had this big flat field, and they would race these old cars around. And sometimes we had no fear. I mean, we would tip the cars over and just thought it was great. You know? I remember the editor-in-chief, Dean Lunt, saying, "Gee, where are your parents? Did they mind?" I said they were both working, so they didn't have a clue what we were doing. But, it was a great carefree childhood, and very fortunate when you think about kids now and all the social media and all that.
Didn't worry about back then.
What's that?
Didn't worry about back then.
Right, Jane knows because she grew up in our neighborhood. Yeah, yeah, your mother used to bake bread. Oh, the smells that came from your kitchen. She would feed the neighborhood kids cookies and bread and anybody who came by, right? Yeah. Do we have, what time do we have, David?
One more question
Oh.
if there's another question.
Sure, sure, absolutely, because there's a couple of things I want to show you about Margaret Chase Library.
No, if anyone else here had a question.
Who does?
You mentioned your mother in the emergency room.
Yes.
Reddington Fairview. I
Yeah.
used to work with Fran.
You look
in the
familiar.
Emergency
Yeah,
room.
yeah. What's your name?
Linda Van Heinen.
Oh, yes, sure, and your husband was a assessor, tax assessor.
Right next to him.
Oh, there he is, Bill. I thought he looked familiar. I worked with Bill when I covered Skowhegan. He was always so good at explaining numbers, which I wasn't so good at, but he had a great way of explaining what things meant, the tax rate and what it meant and what happens when it increases and all that. So, yeah, he was great. Yeah, well, that's nice. I'm glad you mentioned that.
She was a lot of fun.
Yeah, she was. And I talk a lot about her in the book.
And that emergency room was very different than it is now. This was before we had physicians.
Right?
Patients would come in and we had to take care of them, whatever it was, and try to get the doctor on call to come.
Right.
They wouldn't always come. It was quite an adventure.
Right. And I talk in the book about how I had this deal with my mother when I was 16 that I could have the car if I would pick her up at midnight from her shift at the hospital on weekends. And that was my favorite thing because I got to sit in the waiting room and watch all these people come and go. And lots of times there were people who were inebriated or, just. And one time there were no doctors there and this accident came in from a car had gone over a bridge in Solon. And it was Dr. Hornstein, I think she called in, and he came in and there was nobody else there except Dr. Hornstein, me and my mother. And he said, come in here. And he hauled me into a treatment room and he gave me a pair of scissors and said, cut her shirt off. And I was helping to triage. I remember the broken glass in her hair and the blood. And I mean, I loved all of it. I can tell you other stories of things that I saw too, but what's that? That's a really good, no. No, why, we used to, when we got bored as kids, we would go into my mother's closet where she kept her nursing books and look at all the diseases and skin rashes and all kinds of, amputee. It was, I said, no, I don't want to be. Reporter is the closest thing to it. You get to just look at it. You don't have to take part.
You want to tell some stories about Margaret?
Well, last night I started thinking, because you had asked me, David had asked me a few weeks ago if there were any columns in the book about the senator, and I said no, but I did write columns about her, but none that are in the book. But I went into my archives in our basement. I have these big tubs, these plastic tubs that I keep papers in, and all the stories I've ever written, and then they're in garbage bags. And some of them are, categorized or cataloged or whatever, and some aren't. But I did find the story I wrote when the senator died. This was May 30th, 1995. She died on Memorial Day.
On the 29th, yeah.
Yeah. And it was after the parade because they talked about her. She was here. She was in the hospice, or she was on her deathbed, I should say. And this I covered her memorial service out here on the lawn. What I remember about her death is that, well, first of all, when I was a kid, she would come into our classrooms, and I remember her so vividly. Blue suit with a red rose, and she'd have a pocketbook, and she'd talk to us, and we knew she was really important. I didn't really understand, like second grade, exactly what she did. I learned later, but after she had left the Senate, we would see her, many of you may remember her being driven around town in that great big car. You couldn't see over the top of the seat, she was so tiny, but you knew that it was her, and she would be like the parade marshal in the parades, the Memorial Day parades. Then when I started being a reporter, I would, interview her, but when she became close to dying, she was here for maybe, a week before she died, kind of in hospice, but all these media, TV crews and newspapers came from like all across the country, and they were parked out here in the parking lot. And at first it was like, yeah, okay, this is what happens. But for me, it wasn't really annoying because I understood why they were there, but they just hung on and hung on and hung on. Of course, I lived in Skowhegan, so I would come every day, and everybody wanted to get the story that when she died. And ironically, and her nephew, David Bernier, John Bernier, who's so great. He would come out and, give updates, and you were here, and Greg. And,
No, I wasn't.
You weren't here. Okay. But Greg Lamb was here. Yeah. And Angie was here, of course. Angie was her right-hand person. I remember Angie in the atrium sitting with her, and she would dictate letters to you, and you would, yeah. Angie probably knows more about her than anybody. Anyway, the day that she died, ironically, all these news people had left. They were all tired. They left. They split. I was the only one here when she passed away. And John came out and talked to me, and I think Greg. And when there's this beautiful photo of her that the AP took of her waving. A blue suit and a red. I got a picture of her hearse leaving out here on Norfolk Avenue. I was the only one that got anything. I kind of wondered if she had something to do with that. She worked at the Somerset Reporter. She knew what it was like to be a reporter. Do you want me to read this story?
Yes.
Sure. We started out with a quote from her. My creed is that public service must be more than doing a job efficiently and honestly. It must be a complete dedication to the people and the nation, and to the nation, with full recognition that every human being is entitled to courtesy and consideration, that constructive criticism is not only to be expected but sought, that smears are not only to be expected but fought, that honor is to be earned but not bought. And this is the story I wrote. For the last several years of her life, Margaret Chase Smith welcomed both children and adults into her home as if they were family. Often they would come without invitation, tourists passing through and wanting to meet the former senator, students offering a special homecoming gift, and she always took them in. She would ask them lots of questions as if they were more important than she. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, Mrs. Smith exuded dignity. Her snow white hair, intelligent blue eyes, and gentle demeanor commanded a quiet respect. She was gracious, modest, and genuinely interested in others, whether they were prominent political figures or just regular folks. How big this table was then. Perhaps that is one of the reasons she was so admired and loved by the people in her hometown. If it wasn't for Margaret, I wouldn't have been the first woman from Maine to fly in an Air Force jet, said Mary Day, 70 of Skowhegan. In the 1950s, Day was in charge of the local Ground Observer Corps, which tracked aircraft for the Air Force. She asked repeatedly to be given a ride in the T-33, a trainer jet, but always was turned down. I wrote a letter to Margaret in Washington and told her all the reasons why I should be able to get a ride. She picked up the phone and called the Secretary of the Air Force. I got a letter from her just before Christmas saying, best wishes for a happy holiday and a good ride, Day recalled. As a child, Day had been a frequent visitor to the Chase home on North Avenue, where she would sit in rocking chairs and chat for hours with the senator's mother, Carrie. Mrs. Smith was in Washington at the time. One day she said, Margaret's going to make a speech tonight and my radio won't work. So we brought over a big radio of my father's and we plugged it in and put it on our dining room table and we listened, Day recalled. Marion Knight, 93, played the piano at Mrs. Smith's wedding reception. Mrs. Smith had been Knight's basketball coach at Skowhegan High School. They were close friends for many years. She was a great gal to be with, and she was always level-headed, and she knew right from wrong. She was the salt of the earth, Knight said. Governor Angus King Jr. said he considers Mrs. Smith one of his heroes, even though he worked against her on William Hathaway's campaign in 1972. We have always kept in touch, and I consider her a dear friend, he said. I have a picture of her holding my son Benjamin when he was less than 2 months old that I will always cherish. After she retired, Mrs. Smith loved to spend time with the people of Skowhegan. She led parades on Memorial Day, visited school children, attended local VFW dinners, and was frequently seen riding through town in the passenger seat of her big blue Cadillac with green license plates bearing her name. She even answered her own phone, making herself accessible to anyone who called, be they news reporters, friends, or mere well-wishers. She always answered letters promptly, signing every note personally. At her home on Neil Hill off Norwalk Avenue overlooking the scenic Kennebec River, passers-by frequently would catch a glimpse of her sitting in her large sunroom enclosed in glass with Angie. More than likely, she would be wearing a characteristic blue suit on which was pinned a single red rose, her trademark for many years. 2 bridges in an elementary school in town are named after her, as is a library center that is an extension of her home. The library contains many items of memorabilia, including numerous gifts. One is from an 8-year-old boy named Matthew Atkins of Charlotte, North Carolina. The copper rose plaque, which Atkins found in the ground near his home, was restored and donated to Mrs. Smith in May 1991 by his mother and grandfather. Beside it, the words of the senator are prominently displayed. The rose is a true mark of beauty, and there is a feeling of loveliness and peace wherever one is found. It is indeed my favorite flower. And there I took a picture of Willie Turcotte, who was the groundskeeper or caretaker, putting the flag at half-staff. I don't want to take too much more time. I just want to read the story I wrote about her memorial service, just because so many people said nice things about it. The picture, this was dated June 17, 1995, and it's a picture of a very young Angus King sitting beside Bill Cohen, and he's wiping a tear. The memorial service was on the hill over there. There's a big white tent. And it says hundreds gather for service. Margaret Chase Smith anecdotes enliven ceremonies. Former U.S. Senator Margaret Chase Smith was remembered as a role model of courage and compassion, integrity and grace Friday at a memorial service celebrating her life. Hundreds flocked to her home on a sunny hillside overlooking the Kennebec River, where in 1950 she wrote her famous Declaration of Conscience speech, and on Memorial Day this year died at age 97. Margaret Chase Smith, by her deeds and by her words, lived a good and noble life, and each one of us in this country has been enriched by it, U.S. Senator William S. Cohen told a crowd of nearly 1,000. Dozens of dignitaries sat under a big white tent with their hometown friends that included school teachers, town officials, highway workers, waitresses, and children. The U.S. Navy band flew in for the occasion. I just read this last night. Guests included former U.S. Secretary of State Edmund Muskie, who also is a former U.S. Senator and Governor, former Maine Governors John R. McKernan, Kenneth Curtis, and John Reed, U.S. Senators Olympia Snowe, former U.S. Senator William Hathaway, former U.S. Senator George J. Mitchell, and many Maine legislators. Calling her a courageous and commanding woman who single-handedly spoke out against the witch hunts of Senator Joseph McCarthy, Cohen said Mrs. Smith had the endurance of an Olympian and the complexity of a rose. This rose from Maine will remain fresh forever in our minds and will not wither over time, he said. Governor Angus King Jr. told stories that made people laugh. He recalled Mrs. Smith 12 years ago when he worked for the Maine Public Broadcasting Network and did a profile of her life. He came to Skowhegan and spent a whole day with her, but went back home feeling very guilty that he had never told her he had worked for William Hathaway's election campaign in 1972. Hathaway defeated her for her Senate seat that year. I was in a dilemma because I was afraid if I told her it would end the deal, King said. So he wrote her a letter telling her about it and held his breath for 3 days until he received a letter back from her. It said, "Dear Angus King, it is perfectly all right with me that you once worked for Mr. Hathaway. Sincerely yours, Margaret Chase Library." Last November, 4 days before he was elected governor, he went to see her and asked her advice about what he should do. She looked at me and smiled and said, "Get your people to the polls." And I thought that was very profound advice, he said. King and Mrs. Smith used to have lunch together at Sherry's restaurant in Skowhegan. It was always a wrestle for the check, and she always won, he said. So once he went to the cashier ahead of time and asked to pay the bill. She said, Senator Smith came in and paid it yesterday. King recalled to the delight of the audience. Dr. David E. Fry, president of Northwood University, remembered Mrs. Smith as funny, very personable, and very kind. The Margaret Chase Smith Library Center will continue to serve scholars, the public, and school children, he said. We wish you Godspeed, Margaret Chase Smith. We promise to continue to act as if you were standing before us, observing all. It will make us better people in the future, as it certainly has in the past. Other speakers included her attorney and longtime friend, Martin G. Henry, her niece, Ann Heron of Canaan, Library Director Gregory Glant, Dr. Gary Stoker, and longtime friend, Captain Georgia M. McCurley. The Reverend Maynard Hammond officiated America the Beautiful, sung by Elias Thomas III. Before the ceremony started, Muskie, sitting in the front row with his wife Jane, recalled special moments with Mrs. Smith, including the time he was governor of Maine and President Eisenhower came to visit. They had gathered on the very spot Friday's memorial was held. She was a living legend while she was alive, and she's going to be a legend forever, Muskie said. Snow, standing with McKernan under the pine trees in Smith's backyard and chatting informally with visitors after the ceremony, said Smith was a remarkable lady who lived a remarkable life. I think this service exemplified the kind of leadership and the kind of service that she gave to her country, Snow said. Former Governor Curtis remembered granting Smith an honorary degree when he was president of the Maine Maritime Academy. She was so appreciative, just very, very gracious, he said. Now, the next comment that I got from somebody turned out to be someone who's sitting right here, Ellen Blodgett. And I didn't read this till last night, and she told me today that she's coming tonight, which is really weird.
And John Reed is my mom's cousin from Fort Fairfield.
Really? Oh my, well, closer to home, Ellen Blodgett of Fairfield said her daughter had given Mrs. Smith a gift of a tiny gold basket with roses on a field trip to the library 4 years ago. She was very touched and surprised to see it later, prominently displayed among Mrs. Smith's collection at the library. Everybody mattered, Blodgett said. Walking down Norwalk Avenue with his wife, Julie, after the ceremony, Michael Smith, chairman of the local school board, said Mrs. Smith sent the couple a letter of congratulations and $5 each time one of their 3 children was born. Anyone she came in contact with suddenly was on her list, he said. That brings back memories of her, doesn't it? And with that,
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you.
thank you, David.
Oh, so as I was reading the book, I think there'll be moments, well, we're more or less contemporaries, that I could very much identify with things that you were writing about. So one of the things that I noted, chin scars. How'd you get your chin scar?
Oh, Valentine's Day with a broken heart. That's the name of that column. Should I tell it or should I let
Yeah,
them
just-
read it? Okay.
No, yeah, so the way I got mine
Oh,
was,
okay.
oh, yes,
Oh, my
oh, yes. I've winter boots, or actually just rain boots, the black boots with the buckles on them.
Yes.
The metal
we have
buckles?
those.
I fell and cut my chin on a metal buckle. And to this day, I still can't shave my chin properly. Because I still feel that cut on my chin. And I have a little divot, and I can't get in that divot. So there'll be moments like that. We read the book and say, oh yeah, I remember that. And
That's so funny.
the
How many-
candy, oh.
Oh, the kid.
My grandma used to, we take turns, there were 3 kids, and we take turns going on Friday night to my grandparents' house and for the weekend. And my grandmother would give me $1. And that's back in the day when $1 bought you 10 pieces of
Right.
candy. You even talked about penny candy. You were like,
Yeah.
you said you could get 9 pieces of, what, 3 pieces of candy for a penny?
Sometimes at Bushy's store on North Avenue, you could get 3 pieces of candy for a penny. And that's no kidding. So you could get a little bag of, $1 was a lot.
Mm.
That was a lot. Yeah.
Uh,
Be up all night with a bellyache.
So it reinforces the point that Amy was making. Everyone has a story. I've seen it from teaching writing and people who don't think they have a story. Everybody has a story. So thank you for sharing your
Oh, you're
stories.
welcome. Thank you for that.
And one of the customs that we now have for speakers at the library is to give them a Margaret Chase Library. So, there's your bobblehead.
Oh my gosh, that's going in my office with a little letter. That's so nice. Should I
So-
open this?
It's the same thing. It just saves you having
Oh,
to
this is, yeah, oh.
take all the
Thank you.
styrofoam out.
That's so nice. Thanks, thank you.
So when you do put it in your office, please take a picture of it and send it to us.
I certainly will.
We're trying to collect all the places that Margaret is.
I will, I'll be happy.
So what we're going to do is we are going to set Amy up at that table back there. And she will sign books and she will answer any questions that you have, or talk with you.
Yep.
We have books available at the front desk for $20 if you need one. And remind you of upcoming events. Our book group will start on July 18th. Earl Shuttleworth will speak on July 25th. Slime Day is next week. If you're gonna get kids, bring them to Slime Day. Kim can tell you about Slime Day. It was a huge hit last year, 80 people. And then we'll be doing Margaret Chase Smith Day on August 26th. So a lot going on. There's flyers for it out at the front desk. Thank you for coming, and please eat the refreshments. Yeah.
I am 70, so I'm hanging in there. Yeah, it's good to see you, Amy.